Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Ecocide Law and Climate Justice. This panel is the final event in an independent series organised and hosted by Stop Ecocide International here in Glasgow during the COP26 climate talks. And as we know from the Climate Tracker report yesterday, goodwill and ambition alone, as we can see from the NDCs so far resolved, are insufficient to provoke the profound change in practice that is required to face the global climate and ecological crisis, and those least at fault continue to suffer the most. So one of the things that we'll be discussing here, and the key theme, is could an international crime of ecocide create the legal and moral parameter that is currently missing to protect the living world and to begin to redress that balance? And we've got some fabulous speakers with us today to explore that. And we will initially introduce ourselves briefly, then we will have presentations from each of the panelists, followed by a Q&A. So we're going to go through literally as we are now, with a very brief introduction. I'm Jojo Mehta, co-founder of Stop Ecocide International, an initiative which is now, we're now really the communications hub for a growing global movement around a particular aim, which is to make ecocide, or mass destruction of nature, a crime at the International Criminal Court.
Thanks Jojo, for organising and inviting me. I'm an international criminal lawyer. I spent about 20 years dealing with genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes, and about half of that was with the United Nations, and the other half has been with a law firm called Global Diligence, and I recently set up an NGO called Climate Counsel to deal with environmental justice.
And that was Richard Rogers, by the way.
Hello, everyone. My name is Seema Joshi. I'm the Director of Campaigns at the climate organization, campaigning organization Global Witness. So Global Witness, essentially, we investigate, we expose, we campaign against to expose abusive actors, financial flows that are driving climate breakdown. I'm holding it like this so the sound works. Yeah, I think there's not much to say. I mean, we've been here, Global Witness has been at the COP present since Monday of last week. We've been campaigning quite hard to have accountability in the discussions, to make that central, specifically through regulation and also through legal cases. This has come up on various panels that we've been on, and we really want to see the voices of people who have been marginalized, indigenous groups, women, others really feature, center in the discussions. So thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Hello, and thanks also for inviting me. I'm Herman Ott. I used to be a scientist and researcher with the Wuppertal Institute. I've been a politician, a member of parliament for the Green Party in Germany, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Sustainable Development. My main reason for being here, though, is since 2018, I'm building the Germany office of ClientEarth and trying to bring some new elements and new instruments for fighting against ecological destruction to Germany. Thank you.
I'm David Lammy. I'm the Member of Parliament for Tottenham. I am the Shadow Justice Secretary. It's also, I suppose, important to say that I am of Guyanese descent and support a centre called Sophia Point in Guyana, which is in the Essequibo region, and is part of the indigenous community in that small corner of South America.
Wonderful, thank you all very much. And we'll go around in the same order to give our different perspectives to begin with. I'm going to start by giving a bit of background on the Stop Ecocide initiative, and how come, why this word ecocide, why now? The word itself was coined in 1970 to describe the damage created by Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. And it was first mentioned on the international stage by Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme at the first UN Environment Conference in Stockholm in 1972. And so the word itself has been around for a little while. But it hasn't been in the public consciousness, and that has only really arisen in the last few years. And I would like to, at this point, as legal pie embarrassed, and it feels poignant, we bring conversation into the context of COP20 in Glasgow was their birthplace. Polycated the last 10 years towards this particular of promoting ecocide. In response to the question, how can we create the duty of the earth? And one of the that she discovered was that during the drive, the Rome Statute, which is the document national criminal, that actually intended to be a covering serious environmental crimes that needed to the treaty signed in 98. And so what she considered herself to be putting back into place should have been the first place in 2019. But since then, this movement has grown hugely. And in part, there are probably three key reasons for that. One, which is a sort of slightly personal, rather tragic reason in a way, which is that when you have somebody who is quite a strong figurehead for an idea, what can often happen is that people sit back and say, well, they're doing that, so I don't need to worry about it. And what happened when she passed on was that an awful lot of people got in touch and said, this work cannot die with her. We want to help. And that was when we started to discover that she was by no means alone in moving forward this idea, this initiative, and that there were politicians, campaigners, grassroots campaigns, NGOs who were already interested, and lawyers, in fact, a number of lawyers who were already working on this concept. And so what had perhaps seemed something that was a little extreme and left field suddenly began to be something that actually there was a whole collaboration working towards. And so that's been very heartening. I think also we've seen some really stark reports coming out internationally over the last few years, from the 1.5 degree report in 2018 to the incredibly sort of shockingly stark IPCC report of August this year, making it really clear that there are tipping points that have already been passed, some of which may take hundreds, if not thousands of years to remedy, and being very, very clear about that. And in that light, the sort of general realization that we are only crawling in a direction in which we should be sprinting. And then the final ingredient, I would say, which is very important, is that we've seen huge grassroots mobilizations over the last couple of years with the school strikes inspired by Greta Thunberg, and also with Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement in the US, Stop the Mangamizi in Africa, and others. And that growing noise from the grassroots level and disruption has opened up the conversation at the media level and also at the political level, so that effectively what we've been saying for many years is now landing and seeming like, as we've always considered it to be, a no-brainer, common sense, effectively. And so that's a sort of very sort of brief overview of what's happened in the last 3 years in terms of gaining momentum. But a really key milestone was earlier this year when a legal definition of ecocide emerged into the world. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been working definitions over the years, and Polly Higgins had one. There were other groups of lawyers that also had definitions, but they were in a bit the context of a lawyer or a group of lawyers who believed this should be included in international law, and that it should have this particular form, and drafting something that worked for how they saw that. The difference here was that last year we were approached by politicians, by parliamentarians, in fact, from Sweden, from the ruling parties of Sweden, not from the government itself. Sweden has not yet taken an official position on this, but from parliamentarians who came to us and said, your foundation, your movement obviously has the most experience and length of time working on this particular issue. Would you be able to convene, would you be able to commission, if you like, a legal definition that we could genuinely present to our government, that could practically be presented at the International Criminal Court as a potential addition to the Rome Statute? So this was a demand that came from political appetite, and that was the first time that had happened, and it enabled us to pull together a group of extraordinarily talented, well-renowned, and with amazing reputations, all of these lawyers from different places, including Richard Rogers, who's sitting next to me today, and chaired by Philippe Sands QC and Senegalese jurist Gio Falso. This was a group of 12 lawyers from around the world with very different legal backgrounds, some international criminal law, in international public law, environmental law, and climate, and also with very different, perhaps sort of personal approaches as well to law, from and experienced careers in law, from the more sort of formally conventional International Law Commission members to former ICC judge, to at the other end, more activist kind of people's lawyers like Pablo Fajardo, who fought the Chevron case in Ecuador. So a huge range. And the definition which emerged from them was very, very concise. And Richard will go into a bit more detail about it. But it seemed to hit some kind of sweet spot, because since then, and this happened in June, there's been a huge growth in interest at the political level, but also in other sectors. So rather remarkably, just a couple of weeks ago, the International Corporate Governance Network, which is a network of asset management firms from around the world, it's an investor-led network, submitted, and between them, these firms manage over half the world's managed assets, 59 trillion plus. They submitted a statement to COP26, to the presidency. And one of their recommendations to government was to criminalize ecocide, to collaborate internationally to do this. So that just shows you the sort of how far this conversation has moved and how live it is in many different arenas. This is not only is this emerging at the grassroots, at the level of street demonstrations, not only has it been present in the discourses of indigenous peoples suffering in the Amazon, for example, where ecocide has been happening repeatedly for a long time, and many other parts of the world, but it's also now starting to surface in what you might call the corridors of power. So this is a very exciting moment to be talking about this, to be part of this conversation, to be spreading this idea, this initiative. But when I say idea, but it's definitely no longer an idea. We're already hearing from. There are 16 governments who are members of the International Criminal Court, or 16 states, I should say, where this conversation is live in some form at parliamentary or government level. And I would just, as a last, before I hand over to Richard, to say that just yesterday, and these kinds of news are actually coming in, not even just every month, it's every couple of weeks now. Just yesterday, the Belgian Foreign Affairs Committee voted to ask the Belgian government to legislate nationally and internationally, in other words, to support an international crime of ecocide as well. So this is very exciting news. And on that note, I will pass over to Richard Rogers to explain a little bit more, as deputy co-chair of the independent expert panel that drafted the definition, a little bit more about the definition, about the key issues they face, but also why is it that we should be looking at an international criminal law to address this issue of ecocide? Richard.
Yeah, thanks. Is that working? Yeah, I think there was two key challenges. One was really technical, so how to craft a definition that was broad enough to capture the offending conduct, so the worst excesses of environmental abuse, but at the same time was specific enough to satisfy criminal law principles. And the second challenge really was a political one. Is how to come up with a definition that didn't scare off states, because ultimately the states are the ones who decide whether or not to introduce a new crime. And I think we achieved that in several ways, or at least we tried to achieve that in several ways. One was to use very familiar language. So we borrowed a lot of language from other aspects of international law. The second is that we kept it relatively simple. So we didn't list a whole range of specific crimes that might amount to ecocide. We just gave an overall umbrella. And thirdly, perhaps most importantly, we had two thresholds that prosecution would need to prove. So the first relate to the types of actions that might amount to ecocide, and the second relates to the gravity, so the types of harm that might amount to ecocide. So a prosecution would have to prove both. And I'll read the definition, and I better just check I get it right. So the definition that was by consensus that we published was, ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, the hope now is that one or more states will take that definition or some version of it and propose an amendment to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court to add ecocide as the fifth crime. So I'd just like to say a few words about why we need it, why we need an international crime, and what the main advantages might be. So there's currently 4 international crimes in the framework. There is genocide, crimes against humanity, war crime, and aggression. And they only deal with the most serious crimes on the planet. And they were all sort of developed, or at least solidified, soon after the Second World War. And there's been no changes since. So it's been about 70 years we've had those 4 crimes. And so that sort of shows that it's not going to be easy to introduce a new international crime. So some people will say, well, why bother at all if it's not going to be easy? Why not rely on political consensus mechanisms like COP? Why not rely on businesses to act responsibly? But I think it's worth recalling that in the 1970s, several carbon majors knew about man-made global warming, and rather than investing in renewables at the time, they invested in disinformation campaigns to hide the facts from the rest of us. And it was 1988 that a NASA scientist testified before the US Congress and warned the US, and therefore the world, about man-made global warming. But it's taken a good 30 years before political leaders have taken this seriously. So, of course, we have to rely on political leaders and business leaders primarily, but we also need some laws that will provide us with the carrots and sticks so that people like us can hold those leaders accountable. Other people may say, well, why don't you just use the environmental laws or civil laws? Well, there has been some amazing work and some really big wins in the field of climate justice, relying on human rights law. And there's been several civil cases as well where corporations have been sued. But the reality is that unless there is a criminal sanction, so the threat of prosecution and jail time for individuals, then a lot of businesses will simply take the risk, especially if there's a big profit to be had, or they'll simply pay the fine and move on with business as usual. So we really need the threat of criminal sanctions. So other people have said, well, why can't you rely on the current criminal laws that there are at the moment, the international crimes that are available? Well, to some extent we can, but they all have the same limitation. And that is that they require the proof of serious human harm. They're anthropocentric. And so there will be some examples of where we can use, let's say, crimes against humanity to tackle serious environmental destruction. Countries like Cambodia or Brazil, perhaps. But in many, many examples, we won't be able to use the current legal framework. So we need a law that is ecocentric, that gives the natural environment a standing and a status before the courts. And a crime of ecocide would do that, and it would not replace in any way, but it would complement all these other tools that we can use. So as far as I see it, the main advantages are these. Firstly, that an international crime would have very big, sharp teeth in the sense that there can be aggressive prosecutions and very long jail sentences, and that can really change behavior. Secondly, it would have very wide net. So because it's a world court, there are already 123 state parties, and assuming they all accepted the crime of ecocide, the prosecution could then start to investigate and potentially prosecute the worst environmental abuses in 123 states. And I think thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, is the enormous symbolic value. And I think criminal nationally are one of the best ways to change behavior because they set the parameters of what's acceptable. And when you have an international crime, the weight of moral condemnation is even greater. So nobody wants to be seen as the equivalent of a war criminal. Nobody wants to be become some sort of pariah. So it's the combination of all advantages that we hope will start to change consciousness in the sense of the relationship between humans and the natural environment, and therefore will start to create some behavioral change. Thank you very much.
So we'd like to move on now to Seema, if you'd like to tell us a bit more about what Global Witness is involved in and how you feel that this law could assist in that or interact with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jojo, and thank you, Richard, for setting that stage. I'm going to draw from Global Witness's work to really highlight the gaps in accountability that we have seen based on data and research and investigative work that Global Witness has done. The first area, and that's where I think that in Ecocide, not just the law, but this movement, this culture shift that actually, Jojo, when you were speaking, what struck me is, I'm also a lawyer by training, and I really believe in the use of the law. But what I reflect on often is that it's the culture of ending impunity. It's creating that shift in expectation that really is, in my view, the power. When you were talking about the growing momentum of Ecocide, that's where I feel that I've really seen that happen. This culture shift of just the general expectation around those that are destroying the environment. So in terms of Global Witness's work, I wanted to reflect on three pieces that we have seen even here at the COP, where there are gaps of accountability. So the first area of work is in relation to land and environmental defenders. Since 2012, Global Witness, along with some key partners, have been documenting the killings of land and environmental defenders. So these are individuals who are killed protecting their land and protecting their local environment. Most recently, we issued a report about 6 weeks ago now, documenting in 2020 227 deaths of land and environmental defenders. And over the years that we've been doing this, we are sure that, one, this is clearly an underestimate because of the methodology we use. It needs to be publicly reported, and we need to be able to verify the death. So this is clearly an underestimate, 227 deaths in 2020. And what we've also seen is that over the years, the deaths have gone up. So even using a consistent methodology, the deaths have gone up. And what we've also seen is that as the climate crisis worsens, so does the deaths. So actually for land and environmental defenders who are in fact our frontline activists fighting against climate change, there's no accountability. And what really struck me is that last week on Tuesday, we actually had a kind of a remembrance for all of the people that we had documented who had been killed since the Paris Agreement came into force. And we have documented 1,003 killings. And in those killings, there hasn't been accountability. And, often when we do these reports and we come to the recommendation sections of the reports, and the report last year was really looking at corporate accountability and links to extractive industries. Over a third of the deaths are actually linked to extractive industries. Over a third are against indigenous peoples, which is incredibly disproportionate. You know, and when we come to the recommendation section, I always find it quite difficult because, I mean, clearly we need, of course, at a basic level, we need a state investigation into the killing, and we need, with a view of actually having a prosecution. And we need corporate actors, you know, if they have contributed to these killings, you know, directly caused, I would even argue even knowingly benefited from these killings, which are often reflect a sort of a, you know, it's a continuous system, you know, that they know it's happening. Again, it's a pattern. You know, there should be accountability. I wonder, you know, to me, the Ecocide piece is really relevant there because even though, as Richard is you're reflecting on the ICC, for me, the value of Ecocide is if it is accepted as a crime incorporated into the Rome Statute, it will have that trickle-down effect where then states will have to then consider how it becomes incorporated into the national laws, and particularly in some jurisdictions, that can, in principle, lead to a company being held to account, and that would be really amazing. So that is one instance where you know, in a practical level, we see a clear accountability gap. We don't see any incentive by states to basically be investigating or prosecuting these killings, and this trend needs to stop. The second gap, which we see in our work, relates to deforestation. So, you know, as we know, tropical diverse forests, there are so many benefits to having these forests. They are the homes to many indigenous peoples, but on top of that, they are incredible carbon sinks that are actually essential for if we actually are going to stay within 1.5. And then also when you deforest, it also releases carbon into the atmosphere. And what we've seen is that we have produced a few reports, quite a few, basically documenting the chain of deforestation as it's linked to beef companies, soy, palm oil, and the deforestation happening in places, as we've heard, Brazil, but also PNG, Indonesia. And essentially, there is research that is showing very clearly the deforestation that's happening, often in places that are already classified as illegal under the national law, and that these are then going into global supply chains, right? So then you have the supply chains of these big international commodity and agricultural companies, and then we have in fact traced the financial sector that are directly funding these companies, and I think, Jojo, you referred to this statistic, right? That actually, you know, since the Paris Agreement, I think it was 157 billion in deals has been made with companies that in fact have been linked to deforestation. And one call we have been making is for regulation. You know, the financial actors should be held to account. In addition to the international traders. And for me, it is essential that you know, in this consideration of ecocide, and I was listening to the elements, the unlawful, wanton, the knowledge, severe, the consideration of how these Western actors, you know, need to be captured, you know, within this criminal wrongdoing, you know, and or how they are associated with it. There's a real value to basically exploring that and to basically distilling that further. Because, you know, we know that there's an urgency to act, and we have very positive Glasgow Declaration, positive statements about we're going to end deforestation. But again, there's no actual accountability that's attached to it. And we know at the national level, this is the discussion that really needs to be prioritized. The last area that I wanted to speak to was, and Richard has referred to, the fossil fuel lobby. We issued a report, a statement earlier this week where we went through the data that are attending the COP, and actually on the delegates list, which is publicly available, I think there's 40,000 delegates that are there, but we actually identified 503 fossil fuel lobbyists attending as delegates at the COP. And as a country, that would be if they were a country, that would be the largest delegation, the largest country delegation at the COP. Currently, the largest delegation that we were able to identify is Brazil, with just under 480 delegates. The UK had something like, I think, 230 delegates. So it gives you a sense of, you know, it was denialism in the 1970s, 80s. Now it's delayism. You know, this, and we know that this is happening, and they're able to access the decision makers, access discussions, and at the same time, we wonder why there has been such low attention to the need to really cut carbon emissions now, today. We know that actually the impacts of the climate crisis are being felt today, and I find that really striking. You know, and I think this movement around Ecocide and the law of Ecocide it underscores the fact that there is an urgency and we need to act now. I was really struck by, we had a discussion where there was some youth activists from Kenya and from the Philippines who were speaking to the effects that the climate crisis is having today on, for example, you know, the Maasai people, the poverty that the drought is bringing, and how this is affecting young families. And actually many families, because they are in poverty, are marrying off their girls, you know, so they can basically have someone else take care of their children, but also sometimes for financial gain. It's very heartbreaking, but this is what the climate crisis brings. And I think when we consider Ecocide and the impacts and how we are capturing it, I think it's important to consider to build that into the discourse. The very last thing I wanted to say is that, I feel like the criminal court, I think it's such an important piece, and I used to work at Amnesty International, which fought hard for the criminal court. I really, and perhaps in the question and answer in Jojo's moving forward, it'd be really great to really understand like how we can actually also use it to ensure. We don't want these allegations that criminal court is basically being used only against southern countries, southern actors. We don't want to allow this to be sideswiped by these allegations of racism in the court. So I would love in the Q&A to even talk about like how we can really make sure that the Western actors, contributors, you know, they are really also a main part of this discourse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seema. Moving on to Herman, who works at ClientEarth, which has been tackling strategic climate and environmental cases around the world with some remarkable successes under its belt. So could you possibly give us a couple of examples and explain what this new legal tool in the box could provide?
Thank you. Well, I have to make a confession first. I was approached by Polly Higgins some 10 years ago. I was a member of parliament at that time in Germany, and she asked me whether I could support it. I didn't at that time. It seemed too far-fetched. It seemed too radical. It seemed to be totally out of anything that we've seen so far. And maybe being a politician, I didn't want to be outside of the mainstream too much. Now it's 10 years later. So what has changed? Why am I and why are we now supporting Ecocide? Or stop Ecocide. Well, first, the world has changed, and we are seeing the impacts of climate change and ecological destruction all around our planet. Second, our society has changed. We have changed in our perception of what is happening and what needs to happen. And third, the law is changing, and we are part of that. I mean, that's our mission, isn't it? To adapt the law to the needs of society and nature. It was 15 years ago that I was invited in Japan to give a lecture on climate change. And I knew there were members of parliament, I knew there were bureaucrats from the Prime Minister's office. So I tried to think of ways to make them interested in what I was saying. Because, I mean, you all know, we are listening to so many lectures, and it's not easy to remember most of that. So what I said was, some decades ago, in the 30s, there was two countries, well, there was more, but basically two countries, who wreaked havoc on this planet and humanity, Germany and Japan. Why? Why were they possible to do something like that? And my explanation was the political and social systems were not fit for the kind of technological potential that these countries possessed. They had enormous technological power at their hands, destructive power, and their political and social systems were kind of medieval. I mean, they were not democratic, basically. So what's happening now? Are our systems, our political systems, are our societies fit for the challenges that lie ahead now? The enormous technological potential that we have for destruction. This time, not in war, but in peacetime. We are destroying this planet by peaceful means. And my answer to this is no. We are not ready. Our societies, at the national level, in most cases, but also at the international level, at the intergovernmental level, they are not ready. They are not fit. We are seeing it here. I mean, this is COP26. I've been to 22 COPs and many of the meetings and of the intermediate meetings. It is not delivering. Our political systems are not fit. Just think of why the Kyoto Protocol failed. It's because the Constitution of the United States is not fit for the 21st century. It requires, any ratification of a treaty requires a 2/3 majority in the Senate. And since, I think, the Montreal Protocol in the 1990s, no environmental treaty has passed the Senate. It's simply not fit. And that's why the Kyoto Protocol failed. Actually, it was very successful, except for the fact that the US was not part of it. So, why are we then why are we then supporting? There are limits to what politics can achieve. We're going to listen to a colleague here to my right soon. I've been a legislator, I've been a parliamentarian myself. I know what politics can achieve, and that it can never, not in a democracy, be radical. Because, and I mean, this fear is not unfounded, because people do not vote for you if you're too radical, or they vote for you in small numbers. So if you, that's a constant conflict within parliamentarians. Do I go as far as I think we should go, or do I want to be in power and have the chance to change something? That's why change can never come from politics and from parliamentarians. It must come from society. It must grow inside society. And that's something that Stop Ecocide, for example, is doing. It's creating, and has created, and it's continued to create, a movement to change society, to change society's perception. I'm on an international advisory board of an initiative to bring President Bolsonaro of Brazil to the International Criminal Court. It's called All Rise. There are several communications to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court by indigenous groups, by environmentalists, and now by All Rise, for crimes against humanity. What Brazil is doing there, what this government there, and what this person, Bolsonaro, is doing there is nothing less than a crime against humanity and the destruction of the Amazon. Let's see whether we are going to be successful in this. If not, it will make glaringly clear that there is a gap in our international institutions, and that we need another crime and the statute of the International Criminal Court in order to address these widespread, massive ecological changes that individual persons have brought. Why is it important that individuals can be held accountable? Well, I mean, politicians as well as managers of companies are usually not responsible, not liable for their activities. It's the countries or the companies which are then held responsible. We have seen after the Second World War how important it is that individuals are held accountable. And we have seen it afterwards in former Yugoslavia, in Rwanda. And we are seeing it in the activities of the International Criminal Court now. It is extremely important that those who are in power feel that they may be in danger if they continue doing what they do. And that's why I think it is extremely important to have a crime which holds individuals accountable. And secondly, where also individuals and groups, NGOs, can make a communication and initiate proceedings. I mean, formally, of course, it's the prosecution office of the International Criminal Court. So it doesn't go as far as like you can go there and initiate a proceeding. But the prosecutor has to react to the communications to them. And that already makes a difference. So there is a gap here also in our international institutions. Why are we not seeing any cases? No environment cases, no climate cases, but before an international court? Not the International Criminal Court, but also not the International Court of Justice, and no other tribunals. We see a little bit in terms of human rights, because there are tribunals, there are courts to deal with this, where individuals can complain and get heard by courts. This is missing at the intergovernmental level for the environment. Actually, there may be a need for an international court on the environment, where also individuals can be held liable and can initiate proceedings. The law is a sharp weapon in the fight against ecological destruction. And we're seeing it in jurisdictions all over our planet. It's ClientEarth who is bringing much of it, but it's also other organizations. Think of Ogenda in the Netherlands, and think of other activities of Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and the like. So this is a weapon that is has not a reason of existence in itself, but it's supporting people, and that's what it is supposed to do. And that's restoring our trust in democracy and in the rule of law. So I think institutions have to be more intelligent than the people working in them. That's true for constitutions, it's true for international organizations. It's also true for the courts. So we have to create law courts and other institutions which are smart, which are more intelligent than we are who are working in them. And I think having another crime, a fifth crime in the statute of the International Criminal Court would be a very, very smart and intelligent move and bring us a lot further. Thanks.
Thank you, Herman, and very much, last but very much not least, definitely like to invite David Lammy's thoughts on this from perspective both as a parliamentarian, as a lawyer yourself, and also as a long-time and reputed advocate for social and racial justice. What's your sense of how this ties in with your work and your thoughts on it? Thank you.
Well, look, can I just pay tribute to you, Jojo and Richard, Philippe Sands and others for getting us to this point where we have a definition, where state actors, civil society, lawyers, both international and domestic, can focus their minds on what it is that we need to do to make this real. There have been times, I think, throughout the last 10 or 11 days of COP where there has been a sort of frustration, a pain, really, in our hearts that the discussion about emissions particularly has felt technical, has felt more to do with finance than to do with justice. And the frightening, scary, deeply worrying conclusion it seems that we are getting to, which is that we do not leave this COP having achieved 1.5, is that very, very, very seriously and profoundly for countries like Barbados or Bangladesh, this is not a nice to have. This is absolutely the difference between life and death. And so it's important to really bottom out and ground what this overwhelming discussions about emissions is really about. The second thing I would say is, notwithstanding good progress on deforestation, the world committed in New York in 2014 on this subject. It did not stop massive deforestation, and we've just heard about the context, particularly in Brazil. So there is a real issue around accountability. And then the third issue is equity. That in my lifetime, a story when I was, in the 1970s, when I was sort of coming of age, was a discussion about acid rain, turning into a discussion about the ozone layer, turning into a discussion about climate change, and turning now to a discussion about the climate emergency. But the real discussion for me is the discussion of climate justice. And it is to hold justice. And that means that we have to think about what are equitable solutions. And so when you get to equitable solutions, you get to the great arc and the great story of the 20th century. And the great deep story of the 20th century that we had not seen before the 20th century was that people who started that century, subjugated, oppressed, with no rights, had ended that century beginning to assert those rights and self-actualize in their lifetime. Who were those people? Well, they were the black and brown people of the world who had been colonized or, like my ancestors, enslaved. They were women who were the property of their fathers or their husbands. They were LGBTQ people who could not love who they wanted to love in their lifetimes. The disabled, ridiculed, shut away, often from society. And actually, working people and the working classes of the world under the thumb of the boss, my political party, the Labour Party, being born out of a struggle to give those people rights. And here we are at the beginning of the 21st century, and there are some serious dinosaurs around. They're overwhelmingly very, very wealthy. They're overwhelmingly white, and they're overwhelmingly male. All three of those coexisting together, and you sort of land with Donald Trump. And these people cannot be trusted with this agenda. They cannot be trusted with this agenda. And if you think about the architecture that was created in that 20th century, coming out of the horrors of the Second World War, it was overwhelmingly, when you focus on war crimes, when you focus on genocide, when you focus on aggression, to protect minorities. The very minorities that I was talking about that got rights. And once again, we need ecocide, which I suspect will overwhelmingly be to protect minorities. But this time, what's interesting is that in that attempt to say never again, particularly in relation to the Jewish minority, this time, that sense of our brotherhood and our common humanity is profound, because when we talk about ecocide, there is something quintessential to it that diminishes us all if we let this happen, if we let this atrocity stand. So my sense is the time has absolutely come, and very sadly, if the complacency that we're seeing globally continues, and we move, if you like, from a climate emergency to almost a climate war, this is going to have to be the arsenal that we need. Now that's obviously, hopefully, an international article, and I'll say a bit more about that, but importantly, it's a domestic one too, and it's important to understand that with the definition, domestically countries can act, and that's why you're seeing this growing momentum. It might well be small island nations that start with this, but that momentum begins locally. As a lawyer, one knows that offending behavior in society can be dealt with a number of ways. We tend, overwhelmingly, to use the criminal box, and we could have another discussion about mass incarceration. But actually, offending behavior in society can be dealt with by education. It can be dealt with by public health services and public health responses, as well as with criminal sanctions. Why would we think that mass ecocide should not require a criminal sanction as well as the cooperative, negotiative sanctions that we're seeing that emanate from COP? Of course we need the criminal backup to support that. That's what we have in every other walk of life. Why would we not need it in this area? Of course we need it in this area. And just to be absolutely real about the equity point and the climate justice point, and to say this politically, this story that is the climate emergency is not a new story. It didn't begin with the first COP in 1995. It didn't begin when the world started to understand and measure temperature in 1850. It began 400 years ago with extraction. It began with colonialism. It begins with enslaving my ancestors and coming up with systemic racism that gives us a pecking order that puts black and brown and indigenous people at the bottom and white European men at the top. And ecocide levels the canvas. It levels the playing field. It genuinely says that we are all equal. And for that minority that has no rights, our fellow species and ecosystems of the planet, it gives them rights quietly for the first time. That's why it's so profound, so deep, so important. We have to get there. But there are some caveats to this, and I just want to name check those caveats. It's important to understand that the big emitters are not currently at the party. China, the United States, India, Russia are not signatories to the Rome Statute and a party to the International Criminal Court. It's slow, and there is an urgency to act, and the process to get to this framework is necessarily a slow one. The ICC is a court of last resort, in a sense. Therefore, a hell of a lot will have gone wrong before you get to the ICC. That's good and bad, because you hope that the threat of the ICC forces people to act responsibly. And last, of course, this is not retrospective. So again, a lot would have happened. But when you list those caveats, my God, it's staggering that we're still in a context where 20, 30, 40, 50 major countries have not said, yes, the time has come, and actually raised this on the floor of COP. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And I'm aware that you're also on a bit of a timetable this morning, needing to get to other engagements within the COP. And so while we still have you for the next few minutes, I thought it would be good to do just a few short reflections from the panel on that. And actually, I thought first I might ask Richard to perhaps speak to actually one of those caveats that David just brought up, which is the fact that not all countries are members of the ICC. Richard, perhaps you could say a few words about what scope there is in that context, or how that might work.
Yeah, I mean, that is a problem, of course, but I think it's worth remembering that there are 123 states that are members of the ICC. The prosecutor can investigate crimes geographically in any of those states, or the nationals from any of those states. So if there's a crime in, let's say, Cambodia, which is a member of the ICC statute, and that involves a company from the US or China or India or Russia, then the prosecutor can investigate the role of that company, which may be complicit in the crimes. So already it doesn't mean that the actors from those states would always get off sort of scot-free from these types of events. So it would be much better if all countries were members, but it's not a complete disaster that they're not.
Maybe just really quickly, really interesting. For me, the real, I think, congratulations on the Ecocide definition. I love the work. I love the ICC entry point. I think the challenges are, which David said, are very true and very real. I know that Global Witness, with Richard's help, did submit a complaint around Cambodia on land grabbing to the ICC, which has still not been, my understanding is it still hasn't been acted on, but is still under consideration, what that means. For me, it's really important to focus on what the culture shift that this means. If we actually get across this idea that you're accountable for destroying the environment, my hope is that we see states actually come up with their own ecocide laws, which actually then has the wider benefit. So we're not all hinging everything on the ICC, accepting it as the fifth definition, which is very important, but we're having at the same time this movement where states themselves are saying, yeah, we're going to make this illegal. And that would be excellent.
Well, it's very important, thanks to also point to some of the deficiencies of the approach. But I think, and you've made abundantly clear with your passionate statement here, that you think, well, this is minuscule compared to the advantages. And one advantage which I would like to point to is a change in perception of people all around the planet. And that's the perception that humans are at the top of the pyramid and all other beings, fellow beings, are kind of subjected. And rather molded into a picture where humans are part of the web of life. And we share this planet with all other creatures. And there's rights of nature movement, rights of animals, and also Stop Ecocide, I would put here, to give rights to nature, to the environment, which is not dependent on kind of damage done to people, because that's usually the case, right? You only hold someone accountable if there's some damage to the property or the health or life of some humans. But Ecocide is meant to provide for acts which damage nature as such. And I think as such it's a great move to kind of bring forward this idea that humans are part of the chain and not at the top of the pyramid.
Thank you. And there were a couple of things that flagged up for me in all of your contributions as well. One is on the environmental defenders issue, and about it ties in with the sort of symbolic and the reframing that Richard and Herman have both been talking about. At the moment, environmental defenders are sort of portrayed almost as criminals themselves, where they're somehow interrupting legal activities. And of course, once we place ecocide amongst the most serious crimes, the reframing that goes with that is really quite powerful, because those defenders immediately then become moral upholders of the law, and the ones who have to question themselves around what they're doing become the companies where the criminality surely ultimately lies. So that's also a really powerful aspect of the reframing. The other speaks to what Seema and David have both mentioned in different ways around colonialism. I mean, I think ecocide as an international crime has a potential to begin to rebalance what has sometimes been criticised, as the International Criminal Court has been criticised also as a colonial institution. But I think what we see with ecocide is that a lot of the ecocides themselves are happening in the global south, but the ICC aims to kind of go as high up the hierarchy as possible to find the individuals of superior responsibility in the situation, and those are often located in the wealthy north. And so that it does kind of offer this sort of caution to those who have currently, perhaps even within the law that exists, been able to get away with things that have not been able to, that has not been able to be done in the south, to potentially rebalance that. And lastly, to speak to what David was talking about in terms of the sort of time it takes to get this done. And I think this is something that people often say to us, but hang on, this apocalypse is already unfolding around us. How long have we got? We can't, wait 3 to 5 years potentially to get this in place at the International Criminal Court. And, my response to that is twofold. One is we can't afford not to do it. Just because it's not going to be instant doesn't mean it's not worth doing. It's very much worth doing. I mean, you only have to think about something that is been a crime for as long as we can all remember. Murder. Yes, murders still happen, but if murder wasn't a crime, what would happen then? Yes, we need to make ecocide a crime. It's a normative thing. But also there's another aspect to that time frame, which is that when, and David did touch on this briefly, when you can see a parameter approaching, when you can see that new limit appearing on the horizon, that's what actually has you get creative about how you're going to approach that, in terms of, what directions can we go in if that one is going to be closed. And I think the problem that we're seeing is very much that problem. Because there is no hard stop, there is no real incentive to act beyond or in a different way to how we've been acting. A lot of these discussions, in COP around finance and sustainable business practices and all of these things are all ways of trying to play the game better. And unless you change the rules of the game, you're not going to get people playing it differently. And that's what we need. So I just wondered if I could invite David to potentially give us a last few comments, because I'm aware that you need to leave. So if I just hand over to David, and after that we will open to Q&A from the audience. So thank you, David.
Well, it's just sort of on the hope side, and why I think that this has arrived, and sort of using my political crystal ball, thinks that there will be some momentum behind this. Because there are two other things, I think, emerging from this COP. One is a massive generational divide, a deep frustration that I would sort of, it feels, I suspect, like the 1960s, where millennials and younger, who are bearing the biggest burden of the crisis that we're in, are deeply impatient, aren't prepared to wait, and it can be summed up with the phrase blah, blah, blah. And so for them, tools like this, once they have the levers of power, and that's really, as we sadly see baby boomers leave the stage, this will be something that they want. And as night follows day, those millennials who aren't running companies, they aren't running nations, they aren't the senior judges on the ICC, as they get the tools, they will reach into this box. The second thing that I pick up, which I hadn't anticipated, is actually frustrations in the private sector. Now, I'm not talking about fossil fuels, but I'm talking about the big business that is here, does seem to me to be coming to the party in particular ways. And actually what they're expressing is frustration that governments and the international order is not stepping up and de-risking what they are attempting to do. And hence where you started with the asset managers, indicative of saying, we want ecocide. Because once you create regulation that changes the context, it makes it easier for us. You know, my business doesn't want to do something that so-and-so down the road doesn't have to do, basically. So that's another pressure, a peculiar one, because in the end, politically, it's coming from capitalists who want a different architecture with which to operate. And so I think that we should be hopeful. Look, there's still issues about the speed at which we will travel, but I think that we should be hopeful. And it's why I'm very pleased as the Shadow Justice Secretary to have committed the Labour Party to assisting with this cause. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David Lammy. Please have a fantastic rest of your week, and thank you so much for joining us today. Can we have another round of applause for the Shadow Justice Minister? Thank you. Now, perhaps we could open up the floor to questions. If we could give a mic, can we give a mic? If we can spare a mic. Thank you. So Jura is going to come round and bring you the microphone if you have a question to ask. And feel free to ask it to the panel generally, or if there's someone specific, then feel free to direct your question to that person. So shall we see any hands in the audience? So we've got a lady at the back, a couple of questions at the back there if we'd like to start there.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah. It's actually a question, I suppose, about legal capacity, because when you presumably you have a new international law, you need a whole tranche of lawyers who are trained and capable of prosecuting that law. Where is there any sort of plan to build the capacity? I suppose it's chicken and egg, isn't it, until you've got the law? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I don't think there's any plan by the International Criminal Court, and I think many people have said, well, let's have a separate court, an environmental criminal court, because then you would have the expertise that you could employ there, have mix of environmental lawyers and international criminal lawyers, and that's an interesting idea. The problem with that is that it's just going to take forever. And so you're much better off using the structure and the framework that we have already in the International Criminal Court, and if necessary, adding a special chamber. And if there was a new crime of ecocide, as I'm sure there will be, you would hope that the ICC would have some special training, would have some special recruitment procedures where they would hire the right people. The ICC has not got a good record for efficiency, by the way. It's been a great disappointment to almost everybody that's observed it, but it can only improve. And let's face it, the greatest value of the ICC is not the number of prosecutions, but it's just the symbolic power. I mean, it's almost a diplomatic power that it has. So just one single case involving ecocide would really make an enormous difference, because it would make politicians and business people all around the world sit up and think, okay, this is no longer just a human rights risk or a financial risk. This is a risk about me going to prison, and I think that can really focus minds.
Okay, so if we could just pop over to the other side, in the grey top there.
Thanks. I'm here today speaking on behalf of the Haldean Society of Socialist Lawyers and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. And the Haldean Society is based in the UK.
Sorry, can I just possibly ask you to remove your mask and say that again? It wasn't completely clear. Thank you.
Sure.
I'm here today on behalf of the Haldean Society of Socialist Lawyers, which is a UK body, and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, which Haldean is an affiliate member of. And we submitted a statement to the Secretariat calling for Ecocide to be recognised and the rights of nature to be recognised. So the question for David is, to what extent did the negotiations consider the rights of nature as founding the principle for Ecocide, and was customary international law considered, and does he think that's a way forward in terms of the state's reluctance to sign up to the ICC?
I think that might have been for you. But in terms, did you mean in terms of the consideration when the definition was being drafted? Yes.
Yeah. Well, the rights of nature is a really interesting movement, but it's something slightly different. That is, as I'm sure you know, but for everyone else, where like, for example, a river or a mountain might have, or an ecosystem might have its own rights. There have been some in New Zealand, for example, a mountain is protected, and I think Ecuador has some rights of nature. But that's slightly different. That can be complementary, but that doesn't really fit into the criminal law procedure, because the rights of nature, I think, is more about on the civil side. But it's a really interesting movement, and I hope it grows.
Well, yes, and as I've pointed out before, I mean, I think it's part of the same movement in order to change the paradigm of our international order, basically, and of the order in which we feel we are on this planet. And that's why, I mean, if you work towards giving nature individual rights, I mean, like ecosystems, rivers, mountains, forests, whatever, that is part of a parallel process, I would say, than Stop Ecocide. So it works very well together.
Got a whole forest of hands coming up now. Okay, shall we go to the lady at the back there on the right with the you.
Hello, I'm Honor. Thank you very much for the talk. It's been really, really interesting. I just had a question around how close or perhaps how far we are from this becoming international law, and what can ordinary members of the public do to get it up there?
Thank you. I really like that question. I'll take that one briefly, but feel free to anyone else to come in. But in terms of timings, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the last time an actual additional crime was added to the Rome Statute, although it sort of, I guess in the spirit of it, it had been there for many years, but was actually finally added in 2017, which was the crime of aggression. The negotiations around that took 7 to 10 years. Now, we believe this will actually go rather faster. Because we're operating in a different climate, both literally, obviously, but also politically. And we estimate perhaps between 3 to 5 years before this could potentially be being ratified at the International Criminal Court. What we do know is that political advisors, even those on perhaps the side of the spectrum we wouldn't expect to find immediate support for a crime of ecocide, are telling us, we're not telling that, they're telling us, they know this is coming. They just don't know exactly when. So, we already know that the writing's on the wall. In terms of the support for what we're doing, it's interesting. We often get asked, what can ordinary people do? Well, we are all ordinary people. We're just, this panel happens to be quite lawyer heavy, but effectively, we're all able to take action. I think our educational system isn't really great at giving us a sense of agency in the world. But ultimately, very little that's here on this planet is here without somebody intending it to be there. And so collective intention and the public movement around this is absolutely key. And of course, if you go to our website, stopecocide.earth, there's an Act Now menu with a huge range of different things that can be done, from signing up to the campaign to giving a talk to everything in between. But we would say that if there is one single thing that everybody can do, and we know from looking at our analytics really helps, is simply talking about ecocide, actually making it so that that concept and that word is completely unavoidable and becomes a living room conversation, because we know from where the politicians are approaching us and saying, tell us about this ecocide thing, it's where those conversations are happening. It's in those languages and in those cultures, and it's very clear that there's a direct link. So that is a hugely powerful thing in and of itself. Okay, wonderful. So the lady at the very back with the glasses, you've been waiting a little while, I think. Do you want to ask your question? And then the lady that's in front of you, and then we'll come over there.
Thank you very much. This is a question for the panel, but particularly Herman. I was interested in terms of the focus on shifting law to and shifting norms. What the panel feel about the huge contribution to climate crisis of the military, one of the biggest users of fossil fuels, and the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons that has just entered into force, which is desperately needed to divert money away in a similar way to prevent an ecocide. How the panel sees that as a parallel development in a way, given the nuclear colonialism involved with that as well, and the focus on justice.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm a big fan of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, because it actually amends one of the deficiencies that the current system has. I mean, with its focus on emissions as such and the carbon cycle, and points to very concrete activities relating to the extraction and use of fossil fuels. And you wouldn't find coal, oil, or gas anywhere in the treaties, so neither in the Convention, nor in the Kyoto Protocol, nor in the Paris Agreement. And that's a mistake, because those forces that are actually working on it, they are very, very active, as we've just heard, 400 of them, and they are hindering progress. And you know that since 1994, Saudi Arabia is blocking any attempt to introduce majority voting into the proceedings here. I mean, it's in the rules of procedure. Rule 42, you can look it up. But since Saudi Arabia is blocking it, there's no way to adopt it. So these COPs and all bodies, they all operate under a default principle, which is then consensus. So everything has to be agreed. And we all know, I mean, you can't have a transformation by consensus, because there's always going to be one or the other who are not fit for that at the moment. And by the way, the dealers, they are among those who have to consent. I mean, it's not only Saudi Arabia, it's Australia, it's Russia, Canada to some extent, and the United States. They are among them, and they will lose if emissions are reduced, if there's less fossil fuels used. And that is actually a situation which calls for new approaches, some innovative new treaties, new institutions, and I think that's part of it. So we shouldn't only rely on this process. I think, yes, it sucks a lot of attention and energy, but we must alert civil society and also governments that there are options besides of this climate regime here, and that they should be taken, and fast.
Thank you. And I think there's a particular focus there on the military and potentially also the nuclear side of things coming from that question. Would either of you like to add anything to that aspect? I think one of the key things about bringing ecocide into the Rome Statute is precisely the ability to address the destruction that is happening during peacetime. I think it's absolutely correct that we need that the actual use by the military of fossil fuels and the ecocides created by the military are also, going to be a key aspect in that. So I'm going to return to the lady who's just in front there, who had a question waiting. Yes, that's yours.
Oh, thank you. Really, really interesting. This is amazing, I think. The I'm interested in the language and the framework that language provides. And the term war has been brought up a couple of times by Herman Ott and David Lammy. And Herman, you said that that previously action was under wartime, and then this isn't under peacetime. And I was wondering whether that's really very true, that in a way we are actually at war with our ecosystems. And I was wondering whether the fact of that, I don't know what, it might not be in a conventional sense, but certainly the term the war on terrorism, and I don't know what standing that actually has legally, but it's certainly engendered action from governments across the world to take immediate action, and I'm interested in the sense of urgency here. So that this so-called war on terror actually got a lot of action, a lot of activity going from governments. And at the moment, as Jojo, you pointed out, that criminal action is largely when it comes to the Ecocide, is largely targeted at the environmental defenders rather than the real criminals of the companies and in some countries. And I'm just wondering whether that the terminology of terror and trying to draw it away from terrorism being the action by the defenders, but really the action by the companies, are there any benefits or opportunities there for shifting the whole idea of what terrorism is, and that can help engender a sense of urgency within the regulations that we're providing. Sorry, it's a bit vague. Sorry about that.
Thank you for that. I think in terms of, I'm not sure there was a specific question in there, but it seems like it was more of a kind of provocation around language that we use. I wonder whether Seema, you might have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting suggestion. I mean, I think that language is extremely important. And when we see it being used very emotively, in terms of political agendas, that's, which are often, whether it's racism or, yeah. So I think that I like the idea of using the language in a way that gets the point across, and that can be useful for the point of, which we're saying here, of sort of changing the paradigm, sort of the right of nature, or, the ecocide, destruction of environment. I think for me, when we're talking about companies as the actors, I know obviously in the ICC it's individuals who can be held accountable. I think that the power of companies, we have extreme power imbalance. I like it. I just don't know how it's practically. I think there's going to be so much. We can't even get the power of the corporate lobby over politicians and even over the media, to be frank, has become so excessive that I think if we can use the language against companies, let's do it. I think it's going to be challenging. I think that, as long as we don't, I like the idea. I just don't want it to be too. One thing I'm reflecting on is this idea of kind of this very masculine language, right, of terror, and I like the idea of focusing on the impacts and kind of also getting across this idea that we have really significant harm and we don't need to use a masculine vocabulary to really get that across. So that's my only hesitation on this terror. It's kind of, for me, there's a propaganda element of it, which could be potentially dangerous.
Thanks. I sort of recoil slightly when you mentioned war on terror, because as a human rights lawyer, our memory of that is that it basically allowed various states to commit human rights abuses against people. So I think we should move away from that. But what was interesting during the course of the panel's discussion, the drafting panel, is that we thought, well, shall we use the word ecocide at all, or shall we use something else like serious environmental crimes? And the use of the word ecocide has been criticized by not many people actually, but a couple of academics. But But the reality is that ecocide is useful because everyone sort of understands what it is almost immediately, because it's rooted in homicide, in genocide, etc., in infanticide, and it allows people to have a word to get behind, and I think that's really important because, as Jojo mentioned, we really need this movement on the street. We need the young people coming out and calling for change. And ecocide is one change that they can call for, and it's just much better on a banner to say stop ecocide than stop very serious environmental crime. So I think branding matters.
Yeah, thanks for this intervention. And I'm also, like Richard and Seema, very critical of the term war on terror, because it was not proportional to the threat. And it allowed some activities which were clearly not right. What I like about it is, and I was pointing to it before, we are having a situation here where there is destruction without a war. And if you, the term for it is deterritorialization, meaning that there is low-lying states which are on average 1 to 2 meters above sea level, right? Above sea level, and if the water rises, they will vanish completely. And in international law, there's 3 simple criteria for statehood. It's a certain territory, it's a population on it, and it's some rules, not more. Then you've got a state under public international law. And if one of these elements is missing, you don't have a state anymore. So what's happening if the territory of a state vanishes? And that's where I think a lot of also urgency comes into play. What are the implications of that? Do other states have to provide territory for this state? What about refugees? Don't climate refugees need a special status under international law? And I think we're approaching these questions, and I would really like to see an international tribunal or court give us an opinion of what the international law actually has to say about this.
Thank you so much. And we've actually only got a few minutes left, so we'll take one more question and then we'll just go to some brief closing remarks. So if we could take the mustard jumper in the back there, please. Yes, that's you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on something that David finished with, which was hope. And I would just invite the panel to share, if and when this law comes into being, what would the first thing be that you would hope to see happen in that court? Give us some examples of companies or countries or people and crimes that you would like to see addressed with this ecocide law.
I have a particular interest in Cambodia because I filed, with the support of Global Witness, a communication there several years ago which outlined massive environmental harm and massive human harm. So it amounts to a crime against humanity. So, but we're still waiting. They haven't rejected it, but they're so slow at the ICC. So we're still waiting for them to decide whether or not to fully investigate. I would like to see that case investigated, and I would like to see Brazil investigated, because I think the crimes there against indigenous and traditional peoples and environmental defenders is outrageous. And obviously the Amazon is needed by all of us as a carbon sink.
Can I invite both Seema and Herman to give their thoughts on hope? Actually, I think it would be a nice place to round off this discussion. So perhaps Seema, if you'd like to give us your thoughts on what gives you hope.
I'm still hopeful. I wouldn't be here otherwise. The International Panel on Climate Change, while they did find that the effects we've seen are irreversible to this stage, there is very clear that there's still time for action and that we can still take the acts needed to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that is the point, and I feel like ecocide the timing is excellent as far as I'm concerned, because we need to come at this issue from every single angle. And what I see as the angle that is underplayed is the accountability angle. So I agree, Jojo, when you said any discussion, we bring this in, and I've heard it already within 3 different discussions that were not on Ecocide. So for me, you're achieving your objective, which is amazing. So I have hope, and I also have hope when I hear more and more people ask me, well, wouldn't you compare the fossil fuel lobby to the tobacco industry? It's like, yes. And that to me shows that we are going to get this industry, and we need to get them now. And thank you for people who are really working hard on that.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, as I said before, I'm supporting an initiative to bring President Bolsonaro of Brazil before the International Criminal Court. And there are some others, but one is, I think, talking about it, the conception of it, and the sheer possibility is what matters most, I think. Apart from the very concrete having it in the statute. But I mean, our imagination is limited, and when my confession at the beginning of this, I couldn't think of this becoming reality like 10 years ago. Our imagination is so limited. If we are not talking about it, something we cannot name doesn't exist. So that's something which is most important. That's why I would like to support Jojo in saying, well, go out and talk about it, talk to people about it, and it will sink in, and people will realize, yes, I mean, there's something that is so awful, crimes against nature as such, on such a scale, that it's altering life on this planet. I mean, it's not only climate change, it's biodiversity. We are determining which species are living on this planet, and we are pushing every non-human life from this planet. So these are crimes that are being committed, and those who are utmost responsible for it, they should be held responsible and liable.
Thank you so much. And I think that there's some interesting thoughts in this whole sort of discourse around hope, around belief, around intention, and the language that we use, and bringing something into being in the world. I find it interesting and ironic that it is the faith and indigenous leaders of the world, whether it's Pope Francis, the Patriarch Bartholomew, who's just spoken about supporting the criminalization of ecocide, and also the indigenous leaders who've been calling for some time. What they're talking about is a reality, that when we damage the earth, there are consequences. That's kind of factual, and we're seeing it playing out. And yet, so it's almost a kind of reality check coming from the faith leaders, whereas the secular, factual, political leaders are still sort of operating on some kind of faith, faith that, economic growth can continue ad infinitum, or that GDP is a useful construct, all of these things. And I think that this movement in itself brings a kind of hope in that context. And I've literally lost count of the number of times we've had conversations with people, and you can almost see this kind of light bulb going on, in this sense of, wow, actually this is not just pie in the sky. This is something that's actually possible and achievable, and won't fix everything, of course, but is a kind of strategic bridging piece that can be put into place. Because, at least if you're campaigning for human rights, you know that mass murder and torture are crimes. If you're trying to protect the environment, or, you're trying to work in conservation, or you're essentially wanting to protect, our home, which is the earth, and ecocide, of course, means killing one's home, then you don't have currently that foundational piece. And so, that for us is what ecocide could mean. And when you can kind of see when people kind of grasp that, which I think Rich is absolutely right. There's a kind of an intuitive sense of what it means, all of the destruction that's happening to nature in so many ways. Having a word to bring that together is really very powerful, and has an almost instinctive moral reaction. Well, that's wrong, that's bad, that should be stopped. And the kind of the hope that goes with that, I think, is really powerful. And if that can sort of morph into actual intention, this is actually going to to come into place. And I think that is now starting to sort of be reflected back in so many different ways and from so many different sectors and different countries. And I think that's hugely, hugely hopeful. And on that note, I'd love to thank all of our fantastic panelists for an amazing discussion today, and hope you've all been interested, stimulated, wanting to know more and do more about this. Thank you all for being with us, both here and online. Thank you.